Thank you so much for coming here on this rather Arctic day and navigating tube strikes and all other obstacles that have been put here to stop us getting together. But it's fantastic to be here for this important subject, and thanks to Jude Kelly from WOW Foundation and Professor Joanna Bork from Birkbeck College for organising this day. And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this panel. I've got two fantastic guests from across the globe. I have Rahima Mahmut, who is there, and Professor Oscar Guardiola-Rivera, both from areas where the subject that we're discussing is a major issue. My name's Christina Lamb, and I'm chief correspondent of the Sunday Times, and I also write books. One of which you might have heard of because I wrote it with a very famous recent bride. It's called I Am Malala. And my most recent book is about the subject we're talking about today, sexual violence in conflict, and that book is Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, What War Does to Women. Rahima Mahmut is a Uyghur singer, translator, and prominent human rights activist. She's worked closely with Uyghur women that have survived sexual violence and torture in China's concentration camps, translating their testimonies during the Uyghur Tribunal, and working on the groundbreaking BBC news story on systematic rape in the camps. She's also UK Director of the World Uyghur Congress, Executive Director of Stop Uyghur Genocide, and advisor to the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. We're also very lucky to have her here because she's performing later as a musician, so she may tell us a little bit about that. And then next to me, I have Oscar Guardiola-Rivera from Colombia, who is Professor of Political Philosophy and Human Rights at Birkbeck College. He's also author of a number of books, including the critically acclaimed What If Latin America Ruled the World? And most recently, he wrote an account of peacemaking in Colombia entitled The Long Road and the Promise, the Colombian Peace Process as an Example of Aesthetic Justice. And this year, the poetic novel Night of the World, which I can show you. And he is also a fellow of the RSA, a commentator for Monocle Radio, and a columnist for the Colombian newspaper El Espectador. I'm not sure if he also has a musical performance later. You do. Good. Goodness, I'm feeling left out. I don't play anything. So our topic today is rape as a weapon of war, which is a subject extremely close to my heart. I've spent 33 years as a war correspondent, and I've always been much more interested in the people behind the lines and how they feed, educate, protect the elderly, and feed and educate children as all hell is breaking loose around them. The people doing that, of course, are usually the women, and to me, they are the real heroes of conflict, although you won't find any statues to them. Indeed, histories of these conflicts are almost always told through the men, and women's voice is far too often left out. Sadly, there's a darker side of what happens to women in conflict, and that is the rape and sexual violence carried out by soldiers and militias. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've come across stories of such brutality towards women that I've found them hard to write. I think most of us know that feeling of walking down a dark lane at night and hearing steps quickening behind us, or having a male boss push up against us at a work party, or being the only one in a train carriage when a strange man walks in. So imagine what it must have been like to be in the Galaxy Cinema in Mosul, where hundreds of Yazidi girls were kept after being abducted by ISIS fighters. They were sorted into ugly and beautiful, and what terror they must have felt as those fighters came through and touched their breasts, touched their hair, as they decided which one they wanted to take. One of the girls I met, called Naima, told me she'd been traded 12 times between different fighters, and she felt like a goat. She said to me she tried to kill herself several times and did not succeed, and she said even death didn't want me. Rape, of course, has always happened in war. The ancient Greeks, Romans, and Persians were all at it. The very first written history by Herodotus starts with accounts of abductions of women. But we are in 2021, and it makes no sense to me that since 2014, I've seen more of this happening than at any time in my career. I mentioned the Yazidis, but around the same time, the Chibok girls in northern Nigeria, you might remember, being abducted from their school in the middle of the night by Boko Haram fighters. When I went there to report on that, I found that that was just the tip of the iceberg, that tens of thousands of girls across northern Nigeria were being abducted. And then a few years later, 2017, I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingya crisis happened, and around 700,000 Rohingya people fled across the border in just 3 months, most of them women and children. And every woman I spoke to me had horrendous stories of being dragged out of their huts, tied to banana trees, and gang raped by Burmese fighters. This all made me really angry. And as we know, rape is something that is underreported everywhere. But these women actually bravely came out and told their stories, even though they were so difficult to tell. And it was astonishing to me that nothing was done about it. So I started to investigate this, not intending to write a book, actually, initially, just because I was so angry and baffled. And I ended up traveling around collecting testimonies from women all over the world. I went to 12 different countries on 5 continents. But honestly, I could have spent the rest of my life doing it, I think. It's such an epidemic. As we speak, there is ongoing sexual violence faced by the Tigray women in Ethiopia, women in detention centers in Belarus, and the Uyghur community in China. So I'm going to turn over first to Rahima, then to Oscar, to make some remarks about their own particular relation to this subject, and then we will have hopefully some interesting discussion about the reality on the ground, what needs to be done about it, and time for questions. So, Rahima, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It is a privilege to sit on this panel beside Christina and Oscar, and 2 people whose activism I greatly admire. Today, I'm here to discuss how the Chinese authorities have weaponized sexual violence as part of the ongoing genocide of my people, the Uyghurs. Since 2017, our homeland has been turned into a police state. A high-tech network of surveillance technology now covers every corner. There is widespread religious and cultural repression, and around 3 million of my fellow Uyghurs have been imprisoned in concentration camps. These camps are notorious for the horrors that take place within their walls: humiliation, torture, rape, even organ harvesting. Of all the stories that have emerged from the camps, those that shocked the world the most were reports of the brutal and dehumanizing sexual violence directed against prisoners. It has been the testimonies of these brave survivors willing to share some of the most intimate aspects of their trauma that have so often spurred the world into action. Rape has long been used by the Chinese authorities as a weapon and a tactic as they try to destroy Uyghur identity. It is not just women. As we found out when Abdulwali Ayub became the first male survivor to share his experience of gang rape. Being an Uyghur interpreter has meant working closely with many of these survivors to ensure their stories are heard, The first detailed interview I interpreted that took place in 2019 in Turkey, when we spoke to a woman, we called her Ruqya, that had served 4 years in prison. Over the course of 11 and a half hours, she described how she was forced to watch the gang rapes of other prisoners, men and women. She also described a rape room, which was specially designed to carry out these evil violations. She told us that rape was so widespread and systematic in prisons, detention centers, and camps that she expected that around 90% of Uyghur women detained would have experienced it. This is because the Chinese authorities see sexual violence as another torture method to add to their arsenal. They do not recognize the humanity of their Uyghur prisoners. Many survivors will not share their stories because of the deep shame they feel at what has been done to them. Many are young women, worried they will be unable to find a partner, frightened they will bring shame to their families. This means that these members of our community are forced to sit in silence with their trauma, unable to share it with even their closest friends and families. So the second interview I wanted to highlight was one I did with Gulzira Avul Khan, a Kazakh camp survivor, who was forced to clean the rooms used by camp guards and interrogators for raping their victims. She spoke of how she would bring women and girls into the room, remove their clothes, and then fix their wrists to the bed before they were raped. Gulzira's testimony was crucial, and it is now some of the most credible evidence we have from someone forced to assist in these atrocities. Later, Tursunay Ziyavudun came forward with her story after she experienced 3 gang rapes in the concentration camp. So it was that BBC report, viewed by millions, that propelled the Uyghur cause onto the global stage.
Thank you, Rahima, for that very moving testimony. Oscar, can I ask you to say a few words?
Let me first welcome you all. Thank you for being here. I know some of you have been waiting for a while, so I am very thankful for the fact that you did not decide to leave us. Thank you to Rahima and to Christina, and of course, many thanks to our much admired Joanna Burke for helping us creating this space for breathing. What I want to do is very simple and very short. I just want to introduce you to Luz Marina Bejarano. But before I tell her story, or the story that I've heard from her and others like her in my home country, in Colombia, I would like to very kindly invite you to avoid 2 elements which are too commonly used in order to report or narrativize stories such as hers. First, I would like you to steer clear from the very familiar notion that this kind of war is or could be characterized as so-called new wars, meaning no longer interstate wars, but just wars between a small minority of bandits and states that perhaps lack proper institutionality, strong values, and or state presence in the territory. And I would like you to avoid that narrative because it is exactly the other way around. Wars happen in countries such as mine, not because there isn't enough state presence, but actually because of a state presence. It's just that that presence, more often than not, takes the shape of law enforcement and armed forces presence. And more often than not, the law enforcers and or armies of the state are there in order to defend the interests of investors. And more often than not, they happen to be foreign investors, for instance, a Canadian mining company and or a mining conglomerate from the United Kingdom. This is very important because it helps us appreciate why rape as a weapon of war is not something that has always been there, is not something that happens in countries, and this is the second element that I would like you to avoid, which are somehow backwards, which are developing any or underdeveloped. Any of those markers of assumed backwardness. So the spatial element, oh, this only happens over there, those exotic countries in which people do dance very well but are also very chaotic because they have no proper institutions, no rule of law, no human rights, and so on and so forth, and or else this happens back then, you know, those countries which are still on their way. And only if they were to espouse our values, the rule of law, human rights, democracy, blah, 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 then that would solve the problem. Now, let me exemplify this by means of her story. When Luz Marina was 8 years of age, she escaped through the window of her house in a small corregimiento, a very small village near Barranca Bermeja in the west of the country. And she escaped because she wanted to take a bath in the river. So she went and took a bath in the river. What she did not know is that the far-right paramilitary, which always work in cahoots with the army and do the bidding of these investors and the state, had issued an order. This is important, an order. They issued an order that nobody could go to that river. So when she was there, she was found out by 3 members of the far-right paramilitary who proceeded to rape her. She was 8 years of age. The story only begins there. Her story only begins there. She was left for dead. She was found by a matriarch of the community. This is also very important. Many of the communities I am going to talk about, or I'm referring to, tend to have matriarchal lines, Afro-descendant matriarchal lines, and or indigenous matriarchal lines, my own family included. So she was taken by her, healed. The woman who found her was a healer. And she then, Luz Marina then decides to follow their family because they were told that they had to leave. Otherwise, the paramilitary would strike again. So they leave to a town called Barranca Bermeja, which is the oil production hub of Colombia. And there they are welcomed by the union, the local union, La Unión Sindical Obrera. And the local union provides, together with the matriarchs, care services and healing services. Then the paramilitary strike again. This time they enter the neighborhood in which the union's headquarters were located, and they gun down most of the people who they found in the building, including Luz Marina's sister husband. So her father and mother decide to take the family, together with many other families, across the border. So they flee the country and they cross into Venezuela, which is the neighboring country. So all these stories you hear about Venezuelans crossing into Colombia, well, only yesterday it was the other way around. And for very similar reasons. Millions of Colombians left, and when they thought they could come back, then Luz Marina joins the local party, Unión Patriótica, the local party that had been set up in between the 1980s and the 1990s as a way for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia to give up arms and enter into civilian life. But the entire party was eliminated. The entire party, all of them. Only a few survived. Luz Marina was one of the few who survived. So she flees again. This is her third or fourth forced displacement. And she moves closer to the capital, Bogota. There, again, through the self-organized community institutions and the unions, she begins to study as a communications technician. She joins then a community radio station, and as such, she then begins her activism together with other mostly female-led community organizations. And as part of that organization, she joins the so-called Proceso de Comunidades Negras, PCN, a wonderful organization, the Black Communities Progress, or Process, rather. And she begins to work on healing communities affected by stories such as hers. She tells us that in that organization, within that organization, she found many women who had stories that were, she says, worse, much worse than theirs. For instance, that of a woman whose husband, 3 sons, 2 daughters had been killed and or raped. But it is within this organization that she begins to combine what she calls the ancestral heritage. This is a method, a way, a historical memory, a technique of healing, together with psychosocial work. And then she joins as part of that group, and using those techniques, she joins the peace process. I met her in San Sebastián in Spain as part of a Channel B negotiations between the left-wing guerrillas and the state. Channel B negotiations tend to be secret. They tend to be very interesting. And what was most interesting for me, at least, was to see with my own eyes, how is it the case that mostly women were leading the peacemaking process. And there I will leave this small narrative. This is the story of Luz Marina. Now, last year, she had her first son.
Thank you, Oscar, and we'll definitely get into women in peacemaking processes later on, because I think it's a very important part of this. I guess the first question to ask here is, you mentioned, Oscar, about it not just happening in far-off places. I told you that I went to 12 countries on 5 continents. Some people, I'm not sure, many of you perhaps are too young, but for many of us, the first time that we really heard about rape being used as a weapon in war was Bosnia in the 1990s, just a couple of hours flight from here. And frankly, I haven't found a single conflict or war anywhere where it hasn't happened. And actually, I've traveled quite a lot recently with my book. I was in Poland last week. Everywhere I go, people come up to me and say, my grandmother was raped by the Germans and never talked about it, or, you know, this is something that was just kept quiet for so long. So I said that I felt there was an epidemic of this. Do you feel that, Rahima? Do you think that it is something that's happening more and more? And why do you think it's happening?
Thank you. Well, as you have mentioned earlier, this is a kind of weapon that was used against women historically. And at the moment, if I just talk from the Uyghur people's point, that we are completely under siege. So what I spoke about, the camp prisons, but also Chinese government, for example, they did this homestay program since 2014 is as part of control the Uyghur population, also monitor their religious belief or whether they are infected by extremism, they call it. So they send cadres to families. 1 million Han Chinese cadres, they're mainly male, sent to these families. Most of this family, male already put in prison. So this is a kind of sponsored kind of rape is happening. And the reason, when we asked Tursunay Ziauddin, who was so brave to expose what happened to her, and she said it's part of the way to destroy us. Because once a woman raped, experience it, they feel they're worthless. So that is a kind of part of the Chinese government's policy was leaked from the leaked document in 2019, break their lineage, break their connections, break their origin. So this is a way of also breaking people, their spirit.
Thank you. Oscar, why do you think it was used so widely in Colombia?
Well, it was used so widely in Colombia for the very same reasons it has been used so widely everywhere. And you pointed at that, but I prefer the way you put it in one of your books. Their bodies are battlefields. They're not just weapons. They are the very spaces in which wars are fought. And these wars are fought for, to put it very bluntly, colonial reasons. So what you have what you find behind stories such as Luz Marinas is the persistence of both external and internal forms of colonialism. Meaning it is not a coincidence that as the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and that of the newly appointed special peace jurisdiction, an institution that we created as part of the 2016 peace agreements, the rape is now considered not just a weapon to be causally connected with, for instance, counterinsurgency efforts, but rather a form of domination of peoples and territories, precisely what Rahima was describing. And it is not a coincidence, to repeat, that this happens mostly in territories such as the Pacific coast, in the east of the country, and or in the west, which are almost always inhabited by Afro-descendants and or indigenous peoples. Of course, and this is when the language of law is very limited, we're not talking about minorities here, because of course they turn out to be the majorities in these countries, in fact, in the world. And, but it is in these territories where you would find the coal, the rare earths that are used in order to assemble your Apple iPhone in China, and or the lithium salts. And by the by, let me here invite you to attend a performance of a play titled Rare Earth Metal, which is now being performed at the Royal Court Theatre, because it is about precisely the extraction of these materials. So that's the short answer to your question. Why is it happening more and more? Because it is being reported more widely and better because it is being reported by the communities themselves. But B, it is happening because rape happens as part of the global political economy that produces our beloved iPhones. So it is because in these parts of countries such as Colombia, you would find those materials: gold, silver, rare earths, coal, oil. That is why you find stories such as Luz Marinas so often in these parts of the world.
That's certainly the case in the Democratic Republic of Congo too, where a lot of the militias that are using rape are using it to drive people out of areas because those areas have the things that we use in our iPads and phones. But it is also in other areas where it's being used. I mean, Rwanda, where it was ethnic, and Bosnia, other places like ISIS using it against the Yazidis. That wasn't to get control or for colonial reasons. That was because of religious reasons or religious propaganda, where they were told that the Yazidis were devil worshippers and that it was their duty. I guess that's one of the things that I see a difference from earlier times, that a lot of things I've been reporting on recently, people have actually been instructed or ordered to carry out rape. It's not rape that's happening amid the chaos of war. It is a systematic weapon.
It is systematic. I did refer with a purpose to the part of Luz Marina's story in which she talks about the order that was issued by the paramilitary. And the interesting development, the interesting legal development in considering rape not just as a weapon in direct causality to war, but as a form of domination, is that it includes the sorts of events that you are describing. Of course, it happens not only in places where you will find the mine, but it will also happen in places where these communities extend as spaces and or networks of existence. And it happens for religious reasons because, of course, and the Americas are perhaps the clearest example of this, colonialism always happens. I mean, no colonial settler will tell you that he or she or they went there because they wanted gold and the rare earths. No, they'll tell you that they're doing so for your own good. For instance, to bring you the good word of the Bible. So religious reasons, when you speak to these communities in places in the Americas, well, religious reasons, we interpret them as part and parcel of this network of events, of the occupation of vital spaces. And vital spaces do, as Rahima pointed out so correctly, include first and foremost the community fabric, the historical memory, the social textile. And it is not a coincidence that women are targeted first, because more often than not, they are the ones who perform roles as healers, memory workers, storytellers, and political leaders. Something that is very interesting about indigenous peoples in this part of the Americas, but also others, is that, for instance, you would find women playing the high-ranking political roles of their communities. And the young would be the sort of generals of their guardianships, of their sort of security devices, and the elder would be the low-ranking soldiers. It's a very interesting decentering of our familiar hierarchies.
Rahima, you spoke very powerfully about the women feeling broken and about the shame that they feel. This conference is called Shameless. I think one of the things I found most heartbreaking reporting this subject is that the way that women have suffered these terrible things are then often ostracized for the community or made to feel that they did something wrong. Particularly the girls in Nigeria who were taken by Boko Haram. Often when they were rescued by Nigerian soldiers, the soldiers then raped them. Then they went to camps and the communities wouldn't take them back because they saw them as being brainwashed or sullied. And the only way that they could actually survive was to sleep with the camp officials to get food. So these young girls are really being victims over and over again. It's incredibly sad. Probably you heard about the Yazidis, where the communities agreed to take the women back but wouldn't take the children back. So they've had to make this terrible choice of whether to stay with the ISIS captors, keep the children, or leave the children behind and be able to go home. Can you talk a little bit, Rahima, about what it does to women and what can be done to support women who've gone through this?
Yeah, this is a hard part of how we can change and how we can support. It's extremely difficult. I agree with what Oscar said about this kind of colonizing and controlling as part of the weapon. And also for a lot of time people ask me, why Uyghurs, why your community were persecuted so badly, so terribly? Because Uyghurs are very proud of our own identity, our language, and we want to preserve that. We didn't want to be assimilated, although we very much integrated, but that was not enough. So a part of the resistance is because of the pride, being Uyghur. And so part of the weapon to destroy that is rape. And also the Uyghur culture and most of the Muslim cultures, men feel proud to protect their women. So when their women is raped, men also feel being destroyed. So this is a kind of consequences of the whole community to feel so ashamed that they are so weak that they cannot protect themselves. So it's in a way to break their spirit and break their the power of resistance. I worked with these women. We are trying to support them, and they are very lucky to be alive, to be here in the West. But what is happening to the Uyghur women, majorities in my country, it needs international support. Because we know that there is no aid, no support can go in, because China completely blocked the journalists, not allowed to go in. No Uyghurs there to speak to any foreign journalist. My family, my brother, when I spoke to last time, was in January 2017. Said, we leave you in God's hands, leave us in God's hands. I cannot communicate with anyone. Later I learned many families, many Uyghurs detained because they spoke to the families or friends abroad.
Is your family still there?
Yeah, I was the only person left later. My son joined me. My entire family, brothers and sisters, and everyone is there, still living there, but I don't know what happened to them. So under this kind of situation, it's extremely difficult to ask for even like organizations can go there to support them. And maybe from my own activism, I believe that the government, so we need to put pressure on government. So awareness raising, and then people, the people's power, we have to create kind of movements and put pressure. I think in that way, there might be some kind of changes that happens, because China is now behaving in such a way because of its economic power, because the West and many other countries dependent on China. And that chain has to be broken, that has to be, and that is our consumer power as well, through our consumer power, and also through us to put pressure on politicians to not having this trade as usual. The sanctions, I believe, will work, and also like Magnitsky sanctions. So far, UK and EU only sanctioned 4 people. But there are many, we have names of the officials who are actually ordering these criminal acts, and yet they are not being punished. So this is what I think is more effective.
Talking about the need for international support and the lack of justice, I mean, one of the reasons that this is happening so much is because of the widespread impunity. Every woman that I spoke to, every survivor told me what she wanted was justice. I think that means different things to different people. Sometimes it means acknowledgement of what happened. But the fact is that at the moment, accountability is the exception, not the rule. So maybe, Oscar, I could ask you to address that a little bit. Why isn't it being prosecuted? It is rape used in war is an international war crime. It's recognized as such by every member state of the United Nations. So why isn't that happening? And what could the international community be doing or should be doing?
Let's say that there are two kinds of reasons why that is happening. The first kind, and I would emphasize them, have to do with the framework, the historical and social framework in which these events have been either criminalized and, or, as you point out correctly, criminalized in the books but not in action. And then the second set of reasons are of a more, let's say, technical nature, and they have to do with what I already referred to as the limits of law, courts, and even international or transnational institutions. So as to the first ones, well, the perhaps most clear way of putting this is to say, and forgive my bluntness, is that when it comes to these kinds of events, it is assumed that the bodies of women are tokens, that they have been, continue to be, and will continue to be exchanged. And therefore, it is a bit like with poverty, when people tell you, oh, yeah, I can understand your good intentions and your beautiful soul. You want to change the world, but those things have been with us since the dawn of time, and they will be there at the end. That kind of attitude is very widespread and incredibly problematic. And of course, it has to do with the fact that, for instance, we do ignore that when we speak of, some of the first accounts of violence against women. You mentioned Herodotus. Well, for the ancient Greek, the ancient Egyptians were already very ancient. But when you look at the history of ancient Egypt, you find stories such as that of Nefertiti. I'm sure you all remember Nefertiti. What is not told enough about Nefertiti is that she was a pharaoh. She succeeded her husband, Akhenaten. And in fact, she was erased of the record because she led what could be called a cultural revolution. Something happened, and also, I don't tire to tell my students that they should go to the upper floor of the British Museum here in London, go and instead of looking at the mummies, look at a papyrus called the Hunefer papyrus, in which you can see the first image of justice that has been handed to us in history, 1300 before the Christian era. And it is not a coincidence that the figure of justice, the incarnation of justice, is female, Maet, which is a sort of hybridization in between Mother Nature and truth. So that's where the story begins. Something happened in between the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greek, because when you get to the ancient Greek, women have lost already their social status. And of course, Kostas will correct me here because he's the expert on these matters. But what little we know about the status of the legal status of women in ancient Greek cities, in Athens, tells us that they were already classified into two places. One of them was as courtesans for wealthy peoples. The other, the term here was porne, prostitutes. But prostitution was used as a way to bring democracy into the ancient cities. That's a very
want
long story, so I need to stop there.
Yeah, I want to be able to open up to
But
questions.
very quickly, just in terms of the technicalities. The problem with law, particularly international law, is that it tends to reduce crimes to physical extinction and to individual victimhood. And therefore, you have to prove that there is mens rea, causality, that someone actually thought about these things, that very person carried these things through. So the idea that actually it is an order and it follows a chain of command which could be easily interrupted and so on and so forth, that is very difficult for law to get a grip on. And that's part of the technical problem, why we have so much impunity.
It's interesting what you were talking about with Nefertiti. I mean, it leads quite nicely on to, I think, if we just end our discussion on the whether this all links to needing more female participation in different areas, because every successful, and there have been successful prosecutions recently in domestic courts in different countries, everyone that I investigated had a female judge or a female prosecutor, which cannot be coincidence. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I mean, is it that we're not getting it right for women in sexual violence because we're not getting it right for women at any level? And if you look at things like the International Court of Justice, they just appointed their 5th female judge in 20 years of history. That's the 5th out of 110, right? That cannot be right. Colombia, I think, is a good example where women have been very involved in peace processes. And maybe if we can just wrap up our discussion with, if you just tell us a little bit about that, Oscar, briefly.
Well, the reason is, of course, the self-organization and activism of women themselves. I mean, don't give credit to any of the male negotiators that, for instance, turn up to collect the Nobel Peace Prize. Because women like Luz Marina fought in order to open up a space within the wider space of negotiations so that the actual plight and word of women could be heard. Because for many years, and as you know, negotiations such as this one take decades, the word was not there, and what you had was negotiations in between an all-male secretariat of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and an all-male delegation by the Colombian government. And the tone, many of us noticed how the tone of the negotiations began to change once the secretariat of the FARC acknowledged the fact that most of FARC's fighters were women. This is very important. The majority of the guerrilla, including mid-ranking and leaders of fronts, were women. So they clearly put pressure on their very old men to tell them, look, we have been running this thing, so it is up to us to do so. As a result of that, there was a space for women's stories and gender-focused remedies. As a result of that, when the institutionality to realize the peace process was designed, within the special peace jurisdiction, 2 elements were included. Number one, that the majority of the magistrates would have to be women. And number two, that there were specific salas or commissions for violence against women-related issues. And so, when you look at, it's a wonderful contrast. When you look at all the courts in a country such as Colombia, you have the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, and you have the special peace jurisdiction. You see men, white men, women, and a lot of them women of color, most of them, in fact. But that has to do with their activism, which is why the final bit of Luz Marina's story is so important. But it is also important to recognize that they are appealing to what Luz Marina calls the ancestral heritage. You know, these old historical ways, very concrete techniques of healing and conflict resolution. If legal educators, negotiators, and other legal operators were to take seriously those notions, you would immediately see impunity coming down.
I'm going to open it up now to questions. Who would like to ask a question? There's microphones, so if you just put your hand up, somebody will bring you a mic. One just over there.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. I just wanted to ask you, Christina, you mentioned that a lot of the time when women are like freed from, being captured, like the Nigerian women, the Nigerian girls by Boko Haram, and I know it's happened as well with like Jewish communities freed after World War II from concentration camps and ghettos and etc., that they're then often raped by the people who free them. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of why that happens. And I know that you mentioned that, a lot of the time when, it's perpetrated initially, it will be due to orders given. And I'm just kind of wondering why it happens by the people who rescue them.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think some of it is, I'm afraid, opportunism and taking advantage of vulnerable people. And I'm afraid we've seen peacekeepers doing that, UN peacekeepers, and recently World Health Organization people in DRC who were supposed to be helping people with Ebola and were actually sexually assaulting the very vulnerable people that they were supposed to help. So that it makes things very difficult, I think, when that's happening. So, I'm afraid it is a sad fact that there are some, I guess, bad people out there who want to take advantage of people who are vulnerable. Do either of you, Rahima, would you like to say anything about that?
Well, I agree with you completely, and it's very difficult for normal people to understand, of course, these behaviors, but it's quite also cultural background as well is quite important. When this is backed by the regime, it makes it easy for the people, for those evil to carry out. 3 weeks ago, I came face to face with an ex-policeman, Chinese policeman, who actually carried out arrests and torture. And he also explained that in fact, many police doesn't even want to go to work in the end, but they were put on so much pressure, like to capture more, to torture more, to do more. So apart from this kind of evil human nature, also when it is sponsored by a regime, by a powerful regime, that they know that they can get away, and they, this is happening so in such large scale.
Personally, I think there needs to be a lot more research done on perpetrators. I mean, there's not anywhere near enough reporting on the victims, but there's almost nothing on the perpetrators and why people do this. And even I'm talking about people who are ordered to do it, but and sometimes they're doing it in remote places where there isn't really any, they could refuse to do it, they could just not do it, and yet they're doing it. So I think we need to know a lot more about that.
You're very right, Christina. In fact, a brilliant element of your very brilliant question is why there isn't any hesitation, since this is an order coming from above, why there isn't any moment of hesitation when the order reaches the lower ranking members of law enforcement agencies. Well, one potential explanation, to use the concrete case of Colombia again, is the motto of the police, of the law enforcement agencies, is God and Fatherland. So, from the very beginning, the imagination is being framed as all female. the composition of these organizations, all male, sorry, and the composition of these organizations is almost always all male, and there is a clear association between the defense of the country, meaning the fatherland, and the defense of a male-centered gender division or structuration of society. Which is why also it is not a coincidence that the rise of the far right in the Americas, whether it is Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mr. Duque in Colombia, or, God forbid, Kratz in Chile, which might very well be elected president next year, what you see is that in their speeches, in their political agenda, the first item is women bodies control. So no to abortion, for instance. And immediately you have the church and the tremendous weight of the church behind them, and you have all that imaginary reaffirmed. This is why when the rescuers, which are these law enforcement agencies, arrive, very often they just repeat what the other perpetrators have done.
More questions? I think there's one just here.
Is it on? Oh, I couldn't hear it. So thank you all for such like a really interesting talk. I find all of this, I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you all coming here. I was particularly interested in what you mentioned, Oscar. You spoke a lot about women's activism, and you also said that like the reason, one of the main reasons that some of these people are not able to be kind of judged in court is because of the mens rea aspect, because it's so like high in terms of rule of law and all of this. So do you, this is a bit controversial, do you then advocate for a lesser mens rea kind of aspect in terms of the judicial process?
Not necessarily. Perhaps the best way to put it would be to, on the one hand, acknowledge the distinct nature of international criminal law and international human rights law, and on the other, also to acknowledge their intertwinement. Because the thing with law is that if it is a tool, then it can also, it depends of how you wield it. It might be a weapon of war and dominion, or it might be a weapon of liberation. And for instance, something that the mostly female-led judges of the special peace jurisdiction have been doing in Colombia is they marry interpretations of international humanitarian law with international human rights law, using the Yugoslavian precedents in a way that allows them to circumvent, at least to a certain extent, the reductionism of forms of genocide to the pure and direct physical extermination of peoples. So, for instance, they are developing, and they were developing notions of ecocide well before the draft that was circulated and made public earlier this year here in the United Kingdom. And that is also why you have such interesting decisions such as the Our Land Association versus Argentina decision by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which brings together the right to life, the right to health, and the right to the environment to speak of these kinds of violations, rape in particular, as part and parcel of the creation of an environment of violence, an atmosphere of war. This is wording that comes from the Yugoslavian Rwanda tribunals. When you do that, you can create a multi-causal space, and so you're not led or limited by sort of one-way causalism that is so often to be encountered in reductionist conceptions of criminal law. That is one way in which one could perhaps allow for a more expansive and better treatment of these issues.
Who else would like to ask a question? Just here.
Thanks. It might be a bit of an obvious question, but I was just wondering why you would think that women are so often targeted for rape. Is it just because we live in a misogynistic, patriarchal society, or do you think there's other elements to it as well?
Why? Sorry, did you say why women?
Why? No, why women in general? Oh, sorry. Why women in general? So not white women, but just so often the stories of rape in war are about women. You hear about men as well, but much less frequently.
I mean, we should say, and you mentioned it, Rahima, you know, it does happen to men too, and that's even more taboo. I think it particularly happens in detention centres. I've certainly interviewed people who have been in detention centres in places like Syria where it's happened. And actually recently I interviewed a Mauritanian man who'd been in Guantanamo for 16 years without charge. There's actually a movie called The Mauritanian about him. He underwent every form of torture, waterboarding, all sorts of things. When I interviewed him, I didn't realize that he had also been sexually assaulted in Guantanamo by female American guards. And he told me that that was actually the worst thing of everything that he went through, that worse than the waterboarding, everything else. He said he felt completely objectified and that he couldn't bear intimacy now. So it doesn't just happen to women, but it is mostly women. Rahima, do you want to talk about that?
I believe especially when a regime carrying out genocide, and the women are especially if I speak from Uyghur women's point of view, we are very important in the community, cultural carriers and teachers, who resist more compared to men when it comes to assimilation comes to assimilation, and therefore is eliminating women, destroying their spirit. That is actually more important to when they plan to destroy the whole population, because that is in many genocide. That's how it happens, because women are the cultural carriers.
Thank you. Any more questions? Have we got time for? Okay. Sorry, because we started at a different time, I slightly lost count of what time we actually needed to finish. Just remains with me to thank very much for all of you for coming and being interested. I know this is a difficult subject, but it's something I feel very strongly that we need to talk about much more. It is massively underreported. And I can't thank enough my amazing panelists, Rahima, and you can go and watch her perform. Is it in the Barbican, did you say, this evening?
Near Barbican, St. Barks.
St. Barks,
at
okay.
7:30 this evening. Yeah.
And Oscar, thank you very, very much for both of your insights. So thank you.